experience today is sure of a big surprise.
This is a true story my grandmother experienced. Truth be told, during her life, before she and my mum moved out from their home village, she experienced quite a few strange things, and this is one of them. My grandmother lived in a small village and was working as a postwoman. Her job allowed her to meet and talk with old people who told her some spooky, supposedly true stories about the area or people living there. Being a postwoman also meant she had to travel quite a bit to deliver mail, as there were fields, forests, and some people lived further from the center of the village. During spring, summer, and autumn, when the roads were good, she used her bike, and when it was winter or very muddy, she took her horse with a wagon. This happened in the winter or late autumn because she took her horse. As I mentioned, some people lived quite far away, so she had to cross a forest in order to deliver some mail. As she was going back, she took another route in that forest, and somehow she ended up going in circles. She recalled that old folks told her a story that once there was a mansion and it sank into the ground instantly during a wedding feast, and only the priest managed to escape. Everyone else went into the ground with the house. Supposedly, years passed and the forest took over the place, but somehow it remained sinister. My grandmother figured that it must be the same cursed place. She heard that whoever walks into its territory ends up going in circles. She spent a good half of the day trying to get out of it, but no matter where she turned, she ended up going in circles. Round and round she went, not being able to escape. Then, as she got tired, she gave up and spoke to her horse. She asked him to take her home and released the reins, thus giving her horse total control and freedom. That horse brought her home. Turns out she spent a good 5 to 8 hours in there because it was already nighttime when she returned. To this day, she can't explain what happened. That accident occurred after years of work, and she was born in that village, so she knew the place pretty good. So, I was a wildland firefighter back in the day in Arizona. I worked in a forest that was generally popular with a lot of recreation in the northern portion, but I worked on the southern portion of the forest that was really remote. It barely had any roads or campgrounds, so if you wanted to recreate there, you had to work for it. The fire crew I was on had 2 duty stations, one in a small town where the rest of the forest employees worked out of, and the other that was about 2.5 hours away, up a really windy mountainous road. The remote duty station had an old Forest Service ranger station and a newer double-wide trailer that was recently put in. When I worked at this place, it had no cell reception. When my crew and I weren't working, we were playing horseshoes and watching movies. They did eventually add a cell phone booster, which, sadly, made people play on their phones, but I digress. So, for my creepy story, I want to keep it pretty simple. But my supervisor from that crew had experienced some weird things as well working up there. There was one night, he told me he was cowboy camping, sleeping outside with no tent, and kept getting a weird mucousy drop of liquid on his face. He kept looking around and even yelling, and no one was around him. He told me he wasn't below any trees, so he knew it wasn't tree sap. He never slept outside there ever again, which leads me to believe he was telling the truth. Now for my story. I've had other interesting experiences at that remote duty station, but this one was scary. It was the night of July 4th, and we weren't on a fire, so the crew was playing horseshoes and having a good time. Everyone went to bed pretty early because we were going to have a hike the next day. I had my own small room in the double-wide trailer, and my bed was situated next to a big window. I started dozing off, but felt awake still, and I hear one of my co-workers outside my window asking me to come outside. I was laying on my side facing the window, and I didn't look up, but I felt their presence by the window. It felt as though something tall was looming over me from outside. They kept beckoning me, and I said no. Pretty quickly, their voice started changing to a deeper, raspier, angrier voice. They started cursing at me.
Get the hell outside.
I just froze. It was a sort of demonic voice. I lay frozen, not moving while they yelled at me. Eventually it stopped and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and wanted to ask my coworker if he was standing outside my window, but I felt too weird. Perhaps this was a mild form of sleep paralysis, but still weird. So, I've got a few weird experiences from my grandparents' house here in rural Mississippi that I've never quite been able to explain. To start, I'd just like to say that I'm a very objective and logical person. No bragging, just my own personality that I recognize. If something happens, I generally never let my mind wander to crazy, far-fetched places. The first experience was when I was younger, probably 10 to 11. I was watching TV with my grandmother. I call her Mimi. I thought everything was normal until I turned to look at her. She was staring right through me, eyes both dilated and glazed over. I asked, "Mimi?" And she turned her head unnaturally quick upward and reached her hand up and said in a soft, slow voice, "It's so fluffy, soft, airy, touch it." And then slowly let her arm down and went right back to watching TV. Obviously, I was in shock and even whimpered a little because I just couldn't understand what just happened. She heard me and asked if I was okay, and I just kept asking her what she meant and why she just did that. But she was just as confused as I was and just tried to calm me down. She didn't remember any of it. She was young for her grandma at the time and never showed any signs of dementia or Alzheimer's since. Nothing at all since that day. She's always been sound of mind. The next story takes place a few years later. I was about 15 at the time with my brother, 17, and it was pretty late at night. Now, my grandparents' property is surrounded by woods on two sides. The left leading into a deep forest of evergreen, and the behind short and ending at a lake with other houses within throwing distance. I've grown up my whole life in these woods, seen many critters, and was never really scared of them. They were more of a place of comfort and aloneness I liked. But I digress. Back to the story. My brother and I were walking up that long driveway that ended at the road because we kept hearing noises, like moving branches by the tree line, and wanted to check it out. We both knew whatever is in the woods, be it raccoon, possum, coyote, whatever, that logically, we could easily overpower and kill it. On our way back from investigating, I heard walking behind us, and I turned around to see. It was pretty dark, and the only thing we had for light was from my phone, which wasn't much. All I can see was two bright eyes staring back, maybe 3 or 4 feet from the ground. I don't know what it was particularly, but even now, thinking about it, just those eyes and its presence filled me with the most horrific dread imaginable. It's like all my blood turned to ice, and I couldn't stop shaking. It wasn't just basic instinctual fear, but absolute dread. I immediately grabbed my brother's arm and ran as fast as I could to the porch, which has a light that shines about 10 feet into the yard. Whatever this thing was followed us, and when I made it to the porch and turned around, it had stopped just outside of the light, just enough to see those eyes. The way it swayed almost made me vomit. I've never seen any animal sway like that and move its head so oddly. The thing was too large to be a rabid raccoon or coyote. My brother and I quickly got inside and turned off all the lights and hid under our blankets. I went to Nebraska Nation Forest every long weekend with two friends who I'll call Haley and Todd. I have known them for years, and we would never hike alone because of the risks. So we became a group. Anyways, it was spring break last year when we went on a week-long backpacking trip. It was a 7-hour drive there. Being 14, I couldn't drive, but Haley was 16 and Todd 15. Haley drove us there, and we had a great time for the first few hours of the drive. But when we got closer to the forest, something felt off. I know it sounds cliche, but I had this feeling like I was going to be sick. I ignored it and thought I was just nervous. So Haley and Todd noticed that I was off. They asked me what was up, and when I told them something wasn't right, they laughed, thinking I was trying to scare them. A few hours later, and the feeling is still there, but we were at the trailhead. I got out and everything was as it should be. We grabbed our packs and off we went. I felt like I was at home in the trees and the feeling was soon forgotten. We walked a little over 5 miles that day before we set up camp. We had a 2-person tent that Haley and I had brought, and then a hammock Todd had brought. After we set up camp, we ate, and then we were just sitting by the fire, talking. Todd began complaining about how he didn't want to sleep in his hammock. I didn't want to listen to him complaining and offered to switch places. He gladly accepted. So the night went on like usual, until around 2 a.m. when we all got tired and went to bed. Well, everyone but me. I have extremely bad insomnia, so I was just mending to the fire. Finally, I decided to get into the hammock and read. So I put out the fire, grabbed my headlamp, and got into the hammock. I noticed that something was off, but I couldn't place what it was. That's when it hit me. It was completely silent in the woods. No crickets, no animals, nothing. My skin started to crawl. Something was off. I turned off my headlamp and laid down and kept silent. I wanted to try and hear some type of animal and ease my worries. That's when I heard it. Something was dragging against the tent. I wasn't even 5 feet from the tent. It freaked me out, and I did something really stupid. I called out my friends' names. The noise stopped. I got no answer, but this feeling of dread was something I haven't felt before or since. That's when I felt it. Something poked at the hammock. It wasn't like a soft poke. It was like a jab. I was horrified. What the hell had just touched me, and where the hell was it? I was frozen. I also suffer from anxiety and felt the panic rising in me. I couldn't understand what was going on. That's when I made another mistake. I decided I wanted to see what had just jabbed me. All this happened within seconds. I reached up and clicked on my light. That's when I saw it. It was straight out of my nightmares. There was a creature about 4 feet above me staring at me, kind of hunched over. It was about 3 feet off the ground, so this thing was probably 7 to 8 feet tall. It looked like a dog, but it also didn't. It had the face of a wolf, but human in a way. The eyes looked red. Ears looked like clipped pit bull ears. Its mouth pulled back in a snarl, and a hand, claw, paw thing blocking its face. I was terrified. Its teeth were huge and sharp. The paws, if you could even call them that, had 5-finger type things with sharp, long claws that looked like they could tear me apart. I stared at this thing for what felt like hours, but it was only probably 5 seconds. That's when I screamed bloody murder. As soon as I did that, this thing let out something between a scream and a howl. It was deep, and I could feel it. That's when I heard Todd yell, "What the hell was that?" I heard the tent opening, and that's when the creature and I finally broke eye contact. I yelled at Haley and Todd to help me. I looked back up and this thing was climbing the freaking tree. It was still staring at me. That's when I saw the back of it. It had a tail of a dog, greyish silver fur, and a black mane down its back and a hump. I took this opportunity to scramble out of my hammock. We took off without grabbing anything. I had no shoes, nothing. We made it to the car, but the whole time back, I heard something in the trees. The next day, we had park rangers go get our things as we were freaked out. When they got there, everything was gone. Not even trash remained. It was as if we were never there. They accused us of lying. We had no idea what had happened. I had no idea what I saw or why it didn't just kill me. I haven't been back to the woods for a very long time, but still, every time I close my eyes, I see that thing, and hear its roar. The events described here took place in a small country in Northern Europe, sometime between 2008-2009, during the middle of summer. I was around 17 years old back then, and spent a better part of the summer helping my dad. He was a logger, and his workday, as well as mine, started very early in the morning. We would wake up just before 4 a.m. and have a quick breakfast with coffee, dress up, get our gear, and drive out to the forest, which was around 15 to 20 kilometers, 9 to 12 miles away. My family lived in a rather small town surrounded by crop fields and forestry near the country's border, and the aforementioned trip meant you would get far away from civilization. Poor, often disappearing cell signal, old overgrown roads, and absolutely no one who lives there. No one for you to meet on your way to the felling. That's what they call the territory where loggers cut trees. To get to it, we needed to park our 4x4 truck on the side of a narrow road, walk 2 kilometers through thick overgrowth, and then climb down a steep hill. The route to this particular felling did stand out though. On our way there, we would pass an old, long-abandoned house that got my attention the first time I made this trip with my father. Judging by the appearance of the house, it was built at least 80 years ago. Definitely before the Soviet occupation, which meant that it could have been nationalized, with the original owners being deported sometime after 1940. All of the windows were gone, as well as the window frames. The roof was also gone, but you could still make out the individual rooms because the walls and the floor of this house was still somewhat structurally sound. You could also make out a yard that was hidden beneath the overgrowth. On one of our trips, I noticed some posters and a magazine lying on the floor in one of the rooms. It was from around the 80s, so I figured that that's the last time somebody lived there. Anyway, it sure was unsettling to find this abandoned property in the middle of nowhere. But it was only after our 4th or 5th trip that I realized its probable importance. We got to the felling, worked for about 3 hours, and decided to take a lunch break. It was a clear sunny morning, nobody around. Me and my dad sat on one of the bigger trees we cut down previously and proceeded to chow down on our sandwiches, taking occasional sips of coffee we brought with us in a flask. Then it began. Suddenly we both heard a dog barking somewhere in the distance. This was already weird enough since we never heard anything other than the usual forest ambience in our previous days there. What made this even stranger was the fact that the barking noise came from within the forest, the part we had yet to chop and saw our way into. Me and my dad both stopped eating, looked at each other, and without speaking agreed that we would keep listening, and turned our heads towards the forest from where the occasional bark was coming. I eventually said, "Must be a stray dog, or somebody indeed does live somewhere nearby." My dad nodded and said, "Yeah, probably." As we resumed our lunch, it became clear that the barking was nearing our position, and now it was accompanied by distinct human-like footsteps, breaking branches, shoving leaves, and so on. It unnerved me a bit, but I quickly realized that soon enough, somebody would definitely emerge from the forest. Probably someone else who was logging near us. Although it would not explain the dog, as taking your pet to the felling would be very unusual. The barking continued, and the footsteps got louder and closer, close enough that both the person and the dog should clearly be visible. The sound stopped around 30 meters from where we sat, then resumed. Me and my dad kept looking in that direction and seeing absolutely nothing. The footsteps and the barking continued. These sounds now came from a cleared out area where we should have been able to see anyone or anything that stood or moved around there. We looked at each other in complete bewilderment and didn't speak. I could even hear the dog panting and sniffing around, with an occasional step being taken by apparently nobody. Around 40 seconds later, the sounds indicated that this, whatever it was moving away from us. Not back where it came from, but to the left. Soon enough, the sounds got very faint and disappeared. Me and my dad exchanged a few quick theories, but it was clear that neither of us understood what we had just experienced. We resumed work and left this place around the time we usually do, 11 a.m. or so in summer, when it's too hot to go on. And as I passed the house described earlier, I got chills, thinking that maybe what we witnessed is somehow connected to this abandoned property. I should state that we were both well rested that day and used to this type of work. This took place before I started using alcohol, and my dad has been a non-drinker all of his life. I should also mention that neither of us is a skeptic. I have an open mind, and these types of things do interest me enough to search information and read up on it. But we certainly don't spend much time talking about this stuff. I'm sorry for the long read and no monsters or angry ghosts. I'm a journalist by training and profession, so I did my best to describe things in a detailed and engaging manner. The story is not among the scariest ones, but it is absolutely true.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.